Hi again guys, and welcome to another standout car from the new 1.13 update patch, one which has been again requested quite a few times, understandably so, and a car which, although I hadn't looked into or followed the production course of that much before the game, now that it's in the game, it's a very nice car. Now I already knew that it was a good looking car, but when you actually get to drive it in the game, it can sometimes add another level and another layer to that for you. Or it can make you dislike something. It can kind of work either way. For me personally, I definitely like this car more than I did before. I was a little bit indifferent to it. Good looking, but that was about it for me. Whereas now, it's a very useful tool. And one of the main reasons for that is because of the power level which this car is working with, in a very similar way to the Alfa Romeo 4C. Because although when you first look at this car, it would seem like a pretty good rival to something like a Porsche Cayman, which to some degree is kind of true, it's actually a much better rival to stuff like the aforementioned Alfa Romeo, because it's an exotic car, kind of, but at the same time it has great performance from a relatively small spec, because this car only has just under 250 horsepower from a 1.8 engine. It's also got 236 pound-feet of torque, so it doesn't sound that amazing. That's truly hot hatch territory in some cases, but unlike many hot hatches these days, which tend to get bigger and heavier, especially now that more of them are using stuff like all-wheel drive, which Volkswagen pioneers in the Golf R, and before that in the R32, and now the Focus as well actually with the RS, this one is a lot lighter than many modern hot hatches are. It weighs 1103 kilos, and you can drop it a lot lower than that, easily under a tonne in fact. Now the power you can drop a whole lot as well. It's a perfect car for N200, again just like the Alfa Romeo, and the horsepower per tonne straight out of the box is already 225, which is full-on hot hatch territory. In fact, that's good hot hatch territory. So what about actual performance? Because for 70 grand, you'd hope it would be good, of course. Well, one of the things that I like the most about this car, for handling specifically, is that although it's very definitely an Alpine, you can really feel the similarity between this car and the original A110, it's a better car. Of course it's a newer one, so you'd hope it would be, but the original, of course, is a rear-engine, rear-wheel drive car, which in itself can come up with interesting challenges for tuning and driving style, whereas this one is a more conventional mid-engine, rear-wheel drive layout. And the difference that it can make having that engine in front of the axle rather than behind it is a big one, because the handling on the original car is very nimble, but it certainly takes a bit of getting used to, especially for someone who hasn't driven many classics, for instance. Whereas this car, it's a little bit more, you could say slippery. It's not a twitchy car really, but the front end in particular can float around a little bit, especially if you haven't done anything to it, certainly more so than it would in something like an Audi TT Quattro, but at the same time it's very manageable. This is a very easy car to use, and that again ties into the fact that it has less power to work with. Any vehicle that has less power is pretty much always going to be easier to drive by definition. But the great thing about this and the Alfa Romeo, and some others as well, the light car company Rocket in a slightly different kind of way but the same idea, what they can do with a small amount of power is what makes them so good. Because there are plenty of cars in racing games that don't have much power, but that doesn't necessarily make them competitive. Whereas a car like this, in a similar way to a gas turbine or an electric car or a rotary, the performance which it gets from that 250 horsepower is deceptively good. Now the handling on this car is only one part of what makes it good. The category that it's in is so useful. It means that it's a car which you can get a ton of use out of if you do choose to use it, and the straight line performance is very sprightly as well. It's not necessarily fast compared to many other cars in the game, but it certainly isn't slow either. Again, it's well placed, and it certainly punches above its weight, that's for sure. On tight technical circuits, you can quite easily come surprisingly close to some cars with a lot more power. You can keep up in this car, say in the N200 category, with vehicles that could be in N4 or N500, if they're bigger, heavier cars, because more power alone, of course, doesn't guarantee a win. Now, with all of that in mind, it's actually a relatively simple review, because it's a car which definitely impressed me more than I expected it to. but at the same time it's one which doesn't really have any downsides. It's a good looking car, it sounds good, the interior is great, the handling is slightly different to what you'd usually expect, but doesn't take much getting used to. It's very competitive, it's got great acceleration, great top end speed, again for its power, and the pricing, although a little bit higher than some, that is still cheaper, if memory serves, than the Alfa Romeo 4C is. I believe that one's a fraction under 90,000 credits. So overall, if you were looking forward to this car, I'm happy to say you're going to like it. It's a good price, it's a good car, and it's a very useful one, because cars in these lower categories, even if you leave it in the class that it came with, or if balance of performance is applied, a car like this, which is just inherently fun and inherently good, is always going to be useful, because it doesn't need to be the fastest thing in the world, because more often than not you'll find, and many people who haven't done this kind of racing won't know this, but some of the most competitive racing that you can do is in slow cars, because when you're going really fast, it's easy for one person to get quite a big lead in, for instance, formula racing or prototype racing, because although you're all good, the nature of how fast the cars are mean that any single mistake is going to give someone a huge margin over you, which you've got to then get back. Whereas with these slower cars, margins can be much closer, because these cars are all going so much slower than something like a supercar or a race car, that each line through every corner, where you choose to brake, how much throttle you choose to give it, has more of a compound effect, or at least more of a noticeable one. So if you do want some really competitive racing, I would definitely urge you to try racing slower cars. You will be surprised by just how much fun you can have. And with a car like this, and also the classic version, which can be reduced right down to N100, they are very useful for these lower levels. Alpines are excellent cars for getting great performance out of their power. Even the Vision GT cars, as far back as GranTurismo 6, were great examples of that as well. Although I wasn't a big fan of them, what they could do with around 440 horsepower was impressive. This one I would say even more so, and the fact that this actually reached production was kind of surprising to me. This seems like the kind of car that would have stayed as a concept, or maybe not got the funding that it needed, and it's really cool that this car did allow Alpine to return to the market, because it is a brand that a lot of people have a lot of love for obvious reasons. It's a true French sports car mark, and it's very cool to see them back, and from the back especially, I think it's a great looking machine. And in some ways, the shape of this car, and kind of the engine as well, in the way that it's thumpy but small in capacity, reminds me of the Connaught Type D, which was the first ever episode of Unsung Heroes here on the channel. The back end of this car actually looks surprisingly similar to that one, the 2-litre V10 car. So overall, if you haven't driven it yet, 70 grand isn't too bad. You can earn that pretty fast. One race at Blue Moon Bay in career mode, you'll easily pay for that. So give it a try. It's a fun car, a useful one. And of course, stick around on the channel for plenty more reviews. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.